Welcome back to part 2 of the main background painting video series for the Boxers and Briefs first episode. So here what you're looking at is the final background that we're using for the Undies Etc. store. And you may be saying to yourself, that looks a little bit different or maybe quite a bit different than what it did in the first video. And there's good reason for that. And what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes to walk you through the process that was used to complete this background and some of the challenges that arose while I was creating it. So to tell this tale of painful learning experiences, let's begin where we left off last time. And that's with the outlines, or the basic outlines of the building that you're seeing here. So the next step was to go through and draw in some of the bricks that make up the wall around this. And again, I'm thinking to myself at this point, let's go ahead and put all of the line work in. Because all of the coloring and all the shading that's going to happen within this, even though it's simplistic, is based off the line work itself. So here obviously I'm speeding this up quite a bit, kind of roughing in all of this, keeping that look and feel that I'm looking for, kind of filling in some of the purple. And on this side, I'm just going to show you how I roughed in those lines, or the bricks to begin with. And that's with these really crude lines. And these lines are basically just serving as my perspective guide. And I want a little bit of wobble in these simply because it adds some character to the bricks when I lay them in. So that's kind of how I set that up. Then I went through and lined those. Now what I'm doing is going through and cutting out the bench because I want the green of the ground to show through. We're trying to use that limited color palette for this series. So in this case, it's a lot of green, purple, and blue. And here I'm adding in some more hatching, just kind of, again, giving it that feel of some of the old school cartoons that we were referencing. In this case, I'm stripping out some of the block from behind the bench, just adding in some more line work. And I'm experimenting here with some scratching. Again, this was really common in some of the Inspector TV shows and whatnot. So I don't know if I'm going to end up using all of this. I'm putting it on separate layers so I can go back later on and make choices. So now we come to this section where you can kind of see this is the entirety of the line work that I've got. And at this point, I think I'm pretty happy with all of this. Again, it might be a bit overkill. I can always take some of this out, but it does feel very much of the genre and of the aesthetic that we're looking for. So the next thing to do here is I'm starting to add some grunge because I'm just laying in some flat color for the brick, or it actually had some flat color. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to use some of my other brushes to add even more. And again, at this point, I'm experimenting. I haven't really done much in this style before. I know what the style looks like. Now I'm trying to replicate things that I've seen from certain references that I was pulling from. So I'm experimenting with splatter brushes, kind of going in there and roughing in some of the white on top of the purple to give it a bit of a pop. And I started to really like the way the white looked on top of the purple, because then the purple, imagine that this fence was all white. I shouldn't say fence, imagine the brick wall was all white. Then the purple is kind of the shaded version of that, or something that's in shade. Then I'm experimenting with going through and stripping out some of the white in the mortar creases. Then going through and working on the background, kind of the big splotch, or the sky splotch, if you want to call it that sits behind the building. And just adding some layers to kind of break it up. Some splatter marks, just trying to give it that kind of hand feel. A little bit messy, a little bit crude. And now I'm blocking in some of the color for the darker trim that's going to make up the building. And I'm experimenting here. I'm trying to use some brushes to go around it. I'd end up cleaning a lot of this stuff up. Again, I'm speeding through most of this because I want to get to some very key points here shortly. So I've got this dark kind of olive trim and the lighter sections. And the idea with this is that I'm trying to draw attention to the windows and some of the lighter sections of the building. So blocking in things like the glass. And then going through and maybe darkening the underside of the roof just a little bit. Again, at this point, I'm still kind of looking back towards the early kind of color key that I did, which is something else I'd probably do a little bit differently now. Taking care of the roof. And again, kind of adding even a little bit more of the lighter green. Now I'm going to start to worry about the ground just a little bit because I don't want to have it be this solid color. So I'm trying to think to myself, how do I break this up? So I tried experimenting with a little bit darker shade of green. And then I went in and kind of broke up the edge again using a splatter brush, kind of removing some of it. I wasn't happy with it, went back and tried a different approach, different brush, just trying to break it up even more. And then once I've done that, the idea would be to go in there and pull out some of these the individual paving stones by lightening them up. So again, kind of removing that darker wash that I just put over the top of them. And then I'm going to go through and kind of cut out some of the plants from the background, the blue circle that's serving as my sky back behind, doing some experimentation. Again, there was a lot more than what you're seeing here. I'm just kind of speeding through this. And then experimenting with, can I darken down the centers of the plants? How can I kind of break them up just a little bit? So at this point, I stopped, and this is where we had some weather things happen here in town, and I was able to take a couple days away from all of this and then come back to it. And I just really wasn't happy with what I had created to this point. And this happens a lot, I think, especially when you're trying something new. And like I said, I hadn't painted with this style before. But in going back and kind of giving it a fresh set of eyes, there are a number of things I didn't think were working. First and foremost, when I showed it to Sean, the comment was, hey, it feels a little bit swampy. And I totally agreed with it. What's happening is that some of these greens just feel really dark and kind of like algae or like a swamp. It wasn't as bright. It wasn't as colorful as I had wanted. I think that a lot of what's going on in here is way too noisy. So there was too many lines. It was really hard to read. And what you need to keep doing, or what I needed to keep doing, which I wasn't at that point, was going back and saying, what is the focus of this? The focus is going to be these two pairs of underwear that are right there. That needs to be standing out so that when a viewer sees some of this, that's where their focus is going to be. Obviously, I didn't go through and do the blocking up at the top just yet. I was kind of happy with what was happening with this wall. I thought, hey, I kind of like the look of that. How do I take that then and carry it across all these other areas? The other thing that was happening was I think it felt disjointed. When I looked around the drawing, it didn't feel consistent, where I think the bricks felt pretty consistent relative to the building, but I didn't like these stones that were down there. They felt a bit too random. They weren't as square as I wanted. It didn't feel as geometric as I thought the show required. I think parts of this stuff back here was slightly successful. I liked how these were kind of hinted at, and then there's some more here. But again, it just wasn't quite there. I needed more experimentation. So at this point, I started a process of kind of spinning my wheels, where I tried a number of different things, where I started to want to throw everything away and start to say, the color palette's not right, this isn't right, that's not right. A lot of second guessing. And I'm going to talk about why this came up later on. And there's something very specific that I should have done up front, which I knew I should have done, which I didn't, which got me in trouble. And that's the goal of what we're trying to show here, is that not everything is going to be perfect. We're trying this stuff out, and we want to show you what didn't work. So the first place I'm going to start with this is some of the detail. To me, if I zoom in on this, maybe there's too much detail, and especially when we would pull the characters up in front of everything. All the detail back here, all of this detail, there was a consistent detail level across everything, which made everything a little bit hard to read when the characters were on top of it. So for a background, the idea is to keep the colors kind of similar, and you want the characters to pop. And that is also including things like detail. If there's too much detail, the characters get lost on top of your background. So with all this in mind, I jumped in and first tried to just think outside the box entirely. What can I do to get out of the mode of what I'm in right now? And I was second guessing my color choices, so what I wanted to do was a few more color studies. So what you're looking at here are those color studies. And what I did first was go out and to find some more reference. And I started looking at different color palettes. So for instance, let me change this just a little bit. We have this up here from the Pink Panther. And when I go through and I look at this, it's predominantly orange, which is great. And you can see how they're using things like this dark blue on top of that, and there's shades of orange and there's purple mixed in, but it feels very monochromatic, and I liked that about a lot of the things that I was looking at. This one below it had a little bit more going on between the blues and the purples and the oranges, but again, they were kind of playing very nicely together. It was a family of colors. Same thing here, where I had this orange on top of this subdued kind of orange, slightly beige color with this bold blue on top of it. But all these things popped, and for whatever reason, when I would go back to mine, it didn't pop. It just felt drab. It didn't feel alive. Same with this down here. Even though this wasn't the color palette, and this is actually being lit for nighttime, which our scene wasn't in at the time, I liked the way they were handling a lot of the color and the detail, and this using these kind of lines to break things up. So what did I do? Well, like I said, I went through and did some really quick studies. And these are not pleasing to the eye. What this was me struggling to try to work through color palettes. But what I did come away with from some of these was like, okay, if we tried something at night, right? So what I'm doing here is using purple, and I'm layering up this lighter kind of purpley orange, and then maybe trying to pop the windows to make them look like they're illuminated from the inside. Maybe that would draw my eye here. The problem that I was running into here, though, was that the same thing happened that happened on my other version, where I would get these kind of get lost in all this detail, and the front of the building is getting lost because of all this detail. You can't read separation between any of this, so there's still too much going on. What I did really like, though, after looking at some of my examples, was the effect that was happening up here. And that's not to say this works great here, but I like the fact that I've got these lighter lines mixed in with darker lines and the way it's popping certain things out. I thought that was something that was successful on some level that I wanted to play with more. Also, in this case, thinking about could I illuminate the sign, but in thinking through all of this, I think Boxers and Briefs, the show, works better when it's not really at night or during the day. It's kind of nondescript. So we don't have to worry about lighting and shadows and everything else. It keeps it more simplistic, which I think the show is more about in terms of the visual style. I also went through and tried some variations that were all almost entirely green on green, with the exception of, again, playing with some complementary colors here, where I've got this bright orange awning. So what I was trying to do is how can I draw attention to this section right here? The front of the building in this case, you can see I've gone in and stripped out a lot of the detail. What I liked was that this shape was now a lot more clear, except it was still muddled. I mean, it was still too much going on here and there, but it was becoming more clear, and the focus could be more easily directing the eye towards these two pairs of underwear that are so key to our story. And I also started playing again with some of these, the lights, can they be white on top of everything else, trying to determine these palettes. So all that's to say, I did a number of these little tiny tests, just trying to break out, struggling really to figure out what is going wrong. What don't I like about what I'm doing? How can I look at these reference images and see what's working and take that away? Now, one of the problems that we have is that I liked a lot of these palettes, but our characters have a lot of yellow in them and orange, especially Boxers. So he doesn't really stand out as much on something like this or something like this one down here. He kind of blends in. So working through all of this, I really had to discover that color palette, and that's part of color theory, and that's part of the one of the two parts that I was really missing on here was developing that sense of color theory and using a true kind of tried and true approach to color theory that we're going to cover later on in other videos because it's too big of a subject. But right now, I just want to point to the colors that I was looking at weren't going to work with what we had for Boxers and Briefs. So what was I going to do with that palette? All right, so from that point, I jumped in and I did just a little comp. Again, this is a rough. I was taking things that I had, I was throwing stuff out the window, I was like slamming layers together and everything else. And the one thing that stayed fairly consistent throughout was that I thought this little fence area, or I keep calling it a fence, this little stone wall was working well in terms of framing everything. And I liked the way that felt. And I still like the way that the background kind of died off outside of this area right here. But what I started to really think about was having this pop of orange right here. And then what if I changed the color of this up front? What if it was lighter? What if I added a circle down here to mimic what was going on up here? A lighter circle. And what that's doing is trying to draw your eye all the way up into here and all the way up into here. All of this kind of falls back. It pulls the windows forward. It pulls all of this forward. So it's starting to separate things a little bit. And that was kind of the impetus that led towards what actually became the final version of the background. So I really liked the way that this awning was helping. I didn't like the design of the building any longer the way I had it because there's too much going on in this area before. But this awning helped to break things up, and it was a big swatch of color on here to help draw your eye into this area to begin with. So that was my big takeaway here. The doors, I was experimenting with yellow. Eventually they go back to being brown because they're not as important. But anyways, this was, I think, what was the key to kind of cracking this nut of color and of kind of separation of elements within the background. So what I ended up doing was stripping away all of the outlines altogether, and I was just looking at color because the outlines and details get in the way of everything else. And I already knew some of this. I've watched a lot of videos on this, but again, for whatever reason, as we start to work on stuff, or at least as I start to work on stuff, sometimes you forget, or sometimes you're like, no, I can just go ahead and I can handle it. I can add all this stuff on top. Well, it turns out that I couldn't. So here what you're seeing is basically just the color block. And I want to show you why this is starting to be successful, or at least why I think it's starting to be successful. The key to this entire composition, I'm going to make my pen just a little bit bigger, is this building right here. And the way I'm separating this building from the background is by having this kind of circular shape behind that's brighter. I'm also separating the windows here by making them brighter. So you can see the blue is now going to be kind of my separation hue, the color that's going to be pulling things out that are really important from others. I also started to play with how can I frame around these doors. By framing around them, it creates this little box. So if I look here, now I have a box around this, and a box is visually starting to break things up. Again, I have this circle shape down here, which is kind of mimicking, and that's where the characters are going to be. So the characters are going to be standing here and here, and it kind of separates them again because they'll be a little bit, it's a little bit lighter color, but it kind of puts all the focal point here and then up into the window. So it creates this kind of framing element that I want. Now, I just happened to kind of work through and find this solution. But what I should have done up front, and what I'm about to show you here, is the key to all of this. And if you do any kind of research or any kind of online searches about how to do digital painting, one of the number one things you should start with is value. And the reason for this is because what you're looking for is contrast, visual affinity and contrast, and how you're playing with those two things to separate objects from one another. So what I did was take this color block. Again, I had done this first. I drew over the top of all of it right now. But I made it a grayscale version to show you the value of, again, just a grayscale version of this background that I think is starting to become successful. And I want to show you why I think it was becoming successful. Again, if I would have done this up front, it would be way easier to apply color over the top of this. And from moving forward, that's how I'm going to work on most everything that I'm doing for these background paintings. So what's happening here is you've got separation. So look at the pairs of oops, let me go ahead and make another layer here. Check out the pairs of underwear in the front. They are two of the lightest things that are on this entire kind of background here. Same with these up here. They're starting to pop. This roof is not important, but the shape of the building is. So the building is being brought out by this round behind it. And you can see it kind of pushes the building forward. This is kind of a neutral, kind of a 50% almost. So it's neither like super contrasty, but it's got some affinity to it. The front of these fences then are really bright, which draws attention to them. But the other thing that I failed to realize was that when I'm working on this background, I tend to look at the entirety of the whole. The problem with doing that is that this particular background isn't really ever going to be seen in its entirety. It's seen in parts. So for instance, we're going to come up here and see this big sign at the top. And then the camera gun comes down and then it rests in here. This is most of what we're going to be seeing during the entire show. Almost never are we going to back far enough out to see all of this stuff. But if you're working on your background in context of looking at everything all at once, it may not actually work for the shots that you want it to work within in terms of the value. So anyways, this is just to show you that working in grayscale first, getting value, is super important because it does the hard part for you, which is creating visual clarity in your design, in your painting. And again, I knew this going into it, I just didn't do it, and because of that, I wasted a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of stress trying to figure out what wasn't working. So this is kind of my explanation of why this took so long and why it took way longer than it should have. And that leads us to the final background. And again, there's probably a little tweaks here and there I'm going to end up doing to this thing because I'm never quite satisfied with it. But let's look at what happened here. So I went through and I stripped out all of the detail that was back here. And again, instead of using these bricks, I relied on some of the hatching that's really prevalent in these types of designs for these backgrounds. I also went back and started to add in some of these separation lines that I was playing with before. So instead of adding tons of detail back here, I'm using kind of loose brush strokes here to kind of break it up and give the illusion of maybe there's something else back there that I'm not quite defining. Same thing here, where I'm playing with my tones and with my palettes. I don't want to add too much detail to any of this. It's almost like what is important is kind of clearly shown and what isn't important kind of dies off into space. So here we've got this kind of the brickwork up here, where the green behind it is actually the green of the background. Now in this case, it's a little bit darker on this side. But here you can see it's basically just kind of going through. And again, I'll never see the end of the wall over here. But it ties it into the green. So green is the predominant color in here. Everything is kind of layered up on top of that green. The bench is still that green color. I went through, like I said, and I stripped out some of these paving stones here because it was too much information. The characters read better on this simple. And it also draws more attention to the door because now the detail leads up into the door. When I look at things like the awning, you can see what it's doing for me. So again, if I have a shot that looks something like this, and I'm going to draw on top of this really quickly. Now my focus is, you can see how these pairs of underwear are popping here and here. So I have this kind of triangle effect that's happening between these signs up here and this is kind of the anchor to that. This awning in the center is kind of drawing your attention right here, and from there we can draw your eye to this side, we can draw it to this side, we can do all kinds of fun things. So I think that is working more successfully. Turn this off for a second. Thinking about the shots, it's going to start off with something a little bit wider. like this, maybe initially where they come up to the sign, we may pull back and kind of see them standing there. So maybe I will see a little bit of this off to the side. But then we're going to cut in closer up to the sign up here. And if you look at this, I've layered up some noise and some background noise and things like that on top of here using some existing image maps that I had of like paper and scratches and things like that. But even the undies sign, right? I kept the text up here really dark because I was having problems with it kind of blending into what was going on down here. I redid some of these lines here to simplify them just a little bit. So it's going to start here. We kind of scroll down. And in the middle here, I do a transition. Again, going back to some of the color studies that I was doing, I like the transition between lighter lines into darker lines. And here I'm using almost a geometric shape to break this up where it has this point to it. So while you'll never see that necessarily in its entirety, as we're kind of cascading down like the one shot does, it gives me a bit of visual interest. It gives me a bit of a transition someplace up in here that I think kind of adds something to it that comes down. And now we've kind of flip-flopped, so we've got the darker on top of the lighter. But you can see here how this green's darker, which pops from the ground. Again, so we've lightened the ground. This is a little bit darker. It frames out the door, which is a different color, which kind of pulls in. The signs up here, I kept a darker color because they're against the light, which kind of boxes that in. But the bright part here is between boxers and briefs. Kind of that card behind the text, so to speak. And just adding just a little bit of noise using like a scatter brush or like a sponge brush here at the tips of these trees just to give them a little something and then they kind of die off. So the idea, like I said, is that all this stuff kind of dies away and the focus is going to be right inside of here. If I was to take that and put value on it, again, just kind of grayscale, you can see what we were talking about happening here. This is really bright. This kind of stands out. This stands out. The underwear really stands out. When I come up to the sign, it pops. The text pops. The grand opening pops. I don't think they're really conflicting with one another. And it's not to say any of this is perfect by any means. It's not. I could probably do better. I know other people out there could probably do way better. But all of this is working towards that goal of getting more comfortable painting these types of backgrounds. And in this case, explaining what didn't go right and why it didn't go right. But in general, we're pretty happy with the overall look of this. It still feels like that sketchy quality. When you get up close to it, it still has inconsistencies in the lines. There's little perspective things that are happening. Again, it's not supposed to be perfect. But it's supposed to feel rough and kind of quickly put together. And in the end, when I went back and redid all of this, it was way faster. So the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of the background is just knowing that a lot of these things are painted much smaller than what you might see on a screen. And the reason for that is because it doesn't allow you to go in and put tons of detail and tons of time into something. In the case of this background, I think I was overthinking it. I think I got a little bit too close in on some of the details and was trying to be too perfect with it. And the more I backed away from that, the more I started to like it. So anyways, this is the final background that we're going to be using. That was the process I went through. And moving forward, this has given us a ton of different ideas on future kind of videos like this, how we're going to show more of this process and show a cleaner example of how we should have approached maybe this particular background. So hopefully you like these videos. If you do, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're here to kind of show you what we're doing, not to be perfectionists about it, but that's what Escape Pod is all about. So thanks for checking it out. We hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.